We're very excited about today. Thank you, Eleni and Nicole, for joining us. We really can't wait to learn from you today and learn with you. I'm going to first turn it over to Eleni, if you wouldn't mind opening with a prayer, and then I'll introduce who we are as OCP and our purpose, and then we'll turn it over to Matt to introduce you and Nicole. So, Eleni, would you
Great.
mind opening with a prayer? Thank you.
Not at all. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of the eternal Father, you have said with your most holy lips, without me you can do nothing. In faith, we embrace your words with our whole hearts and bow down before your goodness. Help us sinners to do in union with you this work which we are about to begin for your own glory. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you.
Um,
All right. So this session will run from now until about 1:30. Um, I am Anna Habib. I'm one of the Orthodox Christians for Palestine steering group members, and Matt Hobbs is my co-host for this session, and he's also on the OCP steering group committee. We have others in the room who are on our OCP steering group. If you can put OCP next to your name so others can see you. But we have a good number of our OCP people here, which is wonderful. And we'll give Nicole and Eleni about 30 to 40 minutes to give their talk, and then we're hoping to reserve about 30 or 40 minutes for the Q&A. Before we introduce our amazing speakers, I want to introduce who we are as Orthodox Christians for Palestine. I think most of you in the room are familiar with our work, but for those of you who aren't, this is just a very brief overview. Orthodox Christians for Palestine, we consider ourselves a humanitarian movement, and we were started by parishioners in the DMV area, so the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. We are a group of parishioners who advocate for people in Palestine, regardless of religious affiliation. We believe that the voice and actions of the Orthodox Church are essential to lasting and genuine peace. And we do really want to grow our movement. We're a small group of steering committee members, but we're trying to expand our movement and its reach to throughout the country. So please, if you're interested in joining us and starting a chapter in your region, please send us an email, and Matt can put our email address in the chat, and we'll also show it to you at the very end. But our goal is to really make this known and our voice stronger and stronger, and that happens with numbers. So we would love to have you join us. We wanted to start this speaker series because we felt that the Orthodox Christian voice was absent from many of the conversations about justice and peace in Palestine. And we wanted to center the Orthodox Christian witness in these conversations. So, of course, many of you here know, but the Orthodox Church is the indigenous Christian presence of Palestine and the surrounding region, rooted in the very land where Christ was born, lived, and crucified, and rose from the dead, and where the church itself began. For generations, Western colonial history, missionary movements, and political theology have shaped how the Holy Land is understood, and that has often sidelined the voices of local Orthodox Christians, viewing them through an Orientalist lens, to borrow from the great Edward Said. This speaker and discussion series foregrounds the Orthodox Church as the indigenous Christian presence of Palestine and the region, and it focuses on how the Orthodox tradition can offer depth and steadiness to the movement for justice in Palestine. And I'll just add a note that I think today's speakers can help us really do that and think about how the Orthodox tradition can offer us strength and kind of help us process all of the grief and all of the pain that we are witnessing. So I'll turn it over now to Matt to introduce our upcoming speakers and then our speakers today.
All right. Hi, everyone. So coming up in July, we have Ashraf Shaheen, who is a tour guide in Bethlehem, to talk about the living stones in the Holy Land, past, present, and future for Orthodox Christians there. In August, we have Dr. Michelle Abs, who is the General Secretary of the Middle East Council of Churches, to talk about the work that the churches are doing there on the ground in the Levant. In September, we have Father Paul Abernathy, who is a fantastic, inspiring speaker himself, to talk to us about the witness of some of the very inspiring, not that they aren't all inspiring, but the specific inspiring Orthodox saints who found themselves in what many of us would think of as intolerable conditions, or intolerable suffering surrounding them, and to talk about what their life can help us kind of to learn to adapt into our own circumstances. And in October, we have Ramzi Hanhan to talk to us about his new book, Palestine Bleeds for You. And that brings us back to, we kind of mentioned this in the beginning, but just to kind of remind us. So our guest today will be, the talk is being recorded right now. We will spotlight the speaker's videos, so nobody else will be seen on the recording. And then we will clip just their talk and post that to our YouTube channel later so people who missed it can see. And we will be recording still for the Q&A section that will come after that, but we will not include that on the recording. So please, if questions come into your mind during their talk, feel free to drop them in the chat so you don't forget them for later. And we can ask them on your behalf. If you'd rather not speak up, no problem. Or you can later during the Q&A use the reaction raise hand feature, and we can, bring you off mute to talk talk out loud yourself. But just wanted to clarify, nobody else's face will appear on the recording. All right. So that brings us to our esteemed guest today. Eleni Opperwall is a registered psychotherapist and social worker with nearly 2 decades of experience supporting clients from all walks of life. She holds advanced training in perinatal mental health, trauma recovery, EMDR, and attachment-focused therapies. And Dr. Nicole Roccas is a certified trauma-informed coach who helps individuals navigate the intersections of faith, creativity, and healing. Drawing on her background as a writer and her training in trauma recovery, Nicole creates space for people to process life's ruptures, reclaim their voice, and move toward wholeness with resilience and hope. In her coaching practice, she works primarily with writers and others recovering from spiritual trauma. She's also the author of several books on faith, time, and the human experience, and brings the same curiosity and depth from her writing into her coaching practice. She holds a PhD in history with a minor in church history and enjoys reading, endurance running, and inviting herself over to Eleni's for a good cup of tea. And
True.
That's fantastic. I love that you all are neighbors. You're not just, podcast hosts, Zooming to each other across the continent or whatever.
Yeah, Nicole is actually my kubara, so I'm spiritually related to her as well, which is lovely. So
nice.
that's wonderful.
And I have a little bio of your fantastic podcast, which is the means through which I discovered you all's work. Their recreation podcast, which I recommend to absolutely everyone, and I will be doing throughout our Q&A here, is a podcast exploring trauma, healing, faith, and wholeness from an Orthodox Christian perspective. They bring their personal and professional experiences to bear on what it means to become fully human after trauma. And together they weave insights from psychology, theology, everyday life, offering comfort, practical tools, and thoughtful reflections to seek a deeper understanding of trauma and healing in church and beyond. So with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed guest for today.
Thank you so much for those introductions. Eleni and I are really glad to be here. I'm going to sort of give us an overview of what we'll be talking about today, and then I'm going to hand things over to Eleni for a little bit. But while I do that, I just invite folks, if you want, to just drop a line in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. And maybe really briefly, one thing that you're hoping to receive from the talk today. Not going into detail or anything like that, but just like, why are you here? What are you hoping to leave with today? So feel free to drop that in the Zoom chat. Yeah, so full disclosure, Lenny and I were a little bit hesitant when Matt first reached out and asked us to be part of this, mostly because we are by no means very knowledgeable about the situation in Palestine. So, like the socioeconomic, sociopolitical situation there. Um, we're kind of just like everybody else. We get our information from the news. Neither of us have any training in the politics and history in that part of the world. So we really can't offer much when it comes to that particular region. What we can offer, hopefully, is some general things to consider when it comes to managing like being stewards of our own selves, our own compassion, our own capacity to take in information in a world that is very broken, a world that I for sure right now, perhaps throughout all of human history, bears the mark of fragmentation and rupture. Um, and how do we balance trying to be compassionate, um, aware witness bearers to the suffering of others, while also recognizing we are mere human beings and we have a limited capacity to take all of this in. So how do we balance those two things? So our core question is, how do we, especially those of us who are living in North America, and Eleni and I are both joining you from Canada, so this is an international talk, but how do we here in North America respond to traumatic images and stories in the media, on the internet, perhaps even in casual conversations in our churches or our social circles, in a way that honors the Christian desire to bear witness to suffering while also preventing further emotional violence to ourselves via what's called vicarious trauma. And Eleni's going to talk a little bit more about what vicarious trauma actually is. And we recognize that for many in this crowd, that there's an added component here, which is, for many folks, these are not just stories on the news about some theoretical distant place in the world. These are events happening to a place that maybe you've lived before. Maybe you have family living there. Maybe ethnically you are very much tied to the history and the legacy and the traditions and the culture of that place. And so this this is a unique form of suffering because you're here. There's not much you can do. There's a sense of powerless and a sense of distance, but also like a sense of deep care, deep grief. So we recognize that and we hope to speak to that dimension as well. So I'm going to hand things over to Eleni and she's going to talk a little bit about what do we even mean by compassion and how how does vicarious trauma work? And then I'll come back with some practical strategies.
Thanks, Nicole, and thank you to everybody who is dropping some comments in the chat about what they're hoping to hear and talk about today. And as Nicole was saying, like we don't consider ourselves to be experts in any way, shape, or form. We do want to enter into this conversation about vicarious trauma with an eye towards, again, as the title of our talk is Stewarding Compassion, right? So we've been given this gift of compassion and the capacity to feel the pain of other people. How do we actually use that gift in such a way that it furthers more good in the world and that we're actually serving Christ and being Christ to others. So it, a little bit about compassion. I know this feels like something that's so elementary and kind of like we all know what compassion is, but just really opening up with seeing if we can decontextualize that word and just sort of come to know a little bit about how it shows up in our faith life, how it shows up in terms of general psychology, how it's understood, and looking at what it is and what it isn't. So the root of the words, the Latin words that make up the word compassion, come from the Latin word suffering with. So it's this capacity to actually suffer along with someone else who's feeling pain. There's a researcher on compassion. Her name is Kristen Neff, and she's actually done a lot of work on compassion towards others and also compassion towards ourselves, particularly in the context of recovery from trauma. Specifically, she does a lot of work with war veterans. And she defines compassion as the recognition and clear seeing of suffering, feelings of kindness for those who are suffering, so that the desire to help, to ameliorate that suffering emerges spontaneously in recognition of our shared human condition. So part of what happens, I want to break that down because there's a couple parts to that. Part of what happens in compassion is that the desire to help is spontaneously created in us. And it's in recognition that that human nature that that person has is something that I share. This is obviously emphasized, tenfold when it's somebody who is part of your family, who is a friend, who is someone you know, who is part of your cultural group. But it sort of comes from that root recognition of our shared human nature. A quote from Saint Isaac the Syrian that I also wanted to share was, "Let our compassion be a mirror where we may see in ourselves that likeness and the true image which belong to the divine nature and the divine essence." So it's interesting. Sometimes you see these parallels in psychology and religion, and it's like, okay, there's a way that secular psychology sometimes takes you to a door, and then you can go through the door even further within our spiritual tradition, right? From a psychological standpoint, we see compassion as the basis for seeing our shared human nature. And then as Christians, we also know that our shared human nature is also our shared divine nature in the person of Christ. Those two things are shared, our humanity and our divinity now. So it is some capacity to be able to see what's happening in the suffering of another and say, ah, that's also me. So I kind of, drawing from all of that, I wanted to sort of share, breaking it down to 3 key insights about compassion and empathy. The first is just that, like, this is so simple, but compassion is good. It's a gift. This is a divine gift that we're given. It's a virtue. If there's, we live in an increasingly objectifying, very brutal world sometimes, and I think we can get it twisted to see empathy as some kind of weakness or being oversensitive or a liability in some way. And I just wanted to start off by affirming the goodness and the virtuous nature of compassion itself, that there is nothing about that that is inherently damaging or wounding in some way, right? The second is that compassion carries with it an impulse towards action. So as we're feeling compassion, we feel compelled to do something. And this is part of what I think creates a struggle for those of us who might be watching things on the news, who might be hearing accounts from family members or friends or other people who are experiencing what they're experiencing overseas. Is like we experience this arising of a will towards action, and we have to figure out what to do with that. We have to figure out how to develop the discernment to know, all right, this action would be helpful, And there are other actions which actually wouldn't be helpful, and in fact are a form of non-action. So the third point I wanted to make was that compassion, just like all of the virtues or any virtues that that we might have, has the capacity to become co-opted. We know, in addition to all of the billionaires and people who own social media companies that benefit from our suffering with other people, there are people who benefit on that level. There's also, powers and principalities who benefit on a spiritual level, from using that compassion and contorting it in a certain way such that it's manipulated. And so, doom scrolling is a really good example of this. It's actually a lack of action that's disguised as action. Um, there's even like apps you can download that let you know when there's an air raid or a missile attack or other things of that nature, right? And so it's like we have to think about, what do we do with this impulse towards action that is actually fruitful, that is actually being Christ to others? It's interesting. Doom scrolling is sort of the harvesting of our attention. I'm using the term doom scrolling, which is very casual. Are people just familiar with what that means? So it's sort of like the repetitive, numbing, taking in of information or pictures or videos on either social media, or you can also do it on any news website where you are just scrolling away. I'm doing this because usually we have it on our pocket computers or our phones, which, I have one too. And it is something that feels as though you're doing something, but actually nothing has been accomplished. The inverse image of that, and we'll get to this later in the talk when Nicole shares some ideas around what might be helpful action, is prayer, where on the outside it looks as though nothing is happening, but you're actually taking perfect action. So, so just to wrap up, it's sort of knowing that compassion has the capacity to become manipulated or co-opted in these various ways that can lead to vicarious trauma. We have to be very, very careful and develop that discernment with, what do we do? We have this gift and we want to steward it in the most Christ-like way possible. I also wanted to share some things that compassion isn't. Compassion is not the same as being a well-informed citizen. I think, as Nicole was sharing at the beginning of this, I don't know that I'm super well informed about what the situation is in Palestine at this moment. And increasingly, it's difficult to sometimes get good information. And so it can feel like we can feel quite overwhelmed in trying to find the good information, trying to stay on top of everything that's happening, constantly seeking out what's going on now, what's going on now. Being well informed, it's kind of a secular virtue, right? It's like people think that that is something good to do, but I don't think it's a Christian virtue. So that's something to think about and to consider, is like, at what point does the desire to be well informed also sometimes play into situations where we might be overwhelmed, where we might be taking in more information than our nervous systems can handle, more information than a human being can handle, or that we know what to do with. I also wanted to just touch on the fact that compassion is not the same as emotional contagion. So what I mean by that is that when we're sitting in a place of true compassion and empathy, we can respond to someone else from a place of knowing that we're each a person and we are separate people and we might be going through two separate things, but we connect from a place of wholeness with this other person and from a place of deeply rooted love for them. And that is very different from feeling as though the emotions and the suffering of another becomes something that is incapacitating and overwhelms us and renders us very passive and no longer able to make those autonomous decisions towards action that we were talking about. Okay, so that's all to say we're given this wonderful gift of compassion. Um, what is vicarious trauma? And what are the ways that sometimes our compassion can become wounded in such a way that we develop vicarious trauma? Um, so a basic definition of vicarious trauma, I have references. I was sort of assuming people would be bored with that, but I can drop them in the chat if that's helpful.
I can do that,
Um,
Eleni. I've been dropping little bits and references when you're talking, so I can do
Thank you
that.
so much. I noticed that. I have a few article references that I can pop in there too. But I wanted to just open up with a definition of vicarious trauma. It comes from a researcher named Mathieu, and he describes the transformation, he describes vicarious trauma as the transformation of our worldview due to cumulative exposure to traumatic images and stories. So I want to touch upon the aspect of the transformation of our worldview, because I think there's a very different process that happens when we maybe are exposed to stories and images, and we're able to sort of still maintain a view of ourselves and of humanity and of the universe as a whole that is still maybe complex, maybe painful, but a place that we can inhabit. And I think what happens in vicarious trauma is that it feels as though we actually experience the degradation of our entire worldview as a result of the exposure that we've had to some of the things that have happened. Um, so signs of vicarious trauma, you guys might be very, very familiar with this. I think vicarious trauma is something that probably 15 and 20 years ago, I was talking about a lot with people in the context of working in helping professions or potentially working in situations of crisis or disaster, doing humanitarian aid, all of those kinds of things. I think what's been an interesting shift in the past 10 to 20 years is that we're now seeing vicarious trauma as something that can also be perpetuated through media exposure. And so I'm going to drop some references into the chat. I hope that they're formatted okay. But I'm starting off with the Compassion Fatigue workbook from the reference that I drew the definition of vicarious trauma from.
Yeah, I put all of them in the chat already.
Oh, you did? Oh my
I
gosh.
did.
Thank you, Kubata. You're 2 steps ahead. Okay, I haven't been paying attention to the chat because I've been paying attention to my own notes.
Yeah,
So
no worries. No
thank
worries.
you
But you
so
don't
much.
have to
That's
worry about
fantastic.
it.
My attention regulation is like, oh no, multitasking. So thank you for doing that. That's fantastic. But basically, it used to be thought like, okay, news exposure, everybody sees the news. We all listen to the news on TV and radio. It doesn't seem like there's an impact of vicarious trauma that we can detect in research. As as our world has become more media saturated, there's been a real shift in that. Um, so a few signs of vicarious trauma, which you guys may be very, very familiar with. Depression is one, and that can also stem from that change of worldview. A sense of hopelessness, anxiety and symptoms of anxiety can also be another. Sometimes this also intrudes upon sleep. Intrusive thoughts and images can also be a big piece, especially if we've been exposed to media that is visual. So text-based media, there's some research indicating that there's less vicarious trauma that it happens as a result of text-based media versus visual media. So again, if we think about the sources of media that we might be consuming, many of these things are quite visual in nature. And if we're looking at short form media, it means that you could be exposed to dozens of images in the course of a half hour or an hour in a very, very short period of time. Another aspect of vicarious trauma that we might experience is anger and a loss of that empathy. So it's sort of this, anytime we see a virtue being extinguished, we know that it's a vicious cycle, right? And we know that there's something going on there that has spiritual significance as well. We start out with compassion. That's the thing that makes us feel this suffering with, that draws us to some kind of action. But in situations where we maybe don't have some of the tools and some of the resources around us to cope with that impulse towards action, what happens is that empathy and that compassion we had in the first place can be extinguished. And that's where you see people becoming quite angry, suggesting revenge, retaliation, all kinds of things, right? Um, so a few risk factors that we want to consider in terms of vicarious trauma in the media. I've sort of touched on these already, but isolation is a huge one. So one of the aspects of the shift in media exposure over the past 20 years is that media now is something that we are intaking on an isolated level, one-on-one. So it used to be that radio or TV was on, and usually other people in our family would be watching with us, or, we might be in a workplace. Radio used to be on all the time in workplaces, actually. That's changed quite a bit. Now, what's happening increasingly is that we are in isolation, taking in stories and images. And, our family members we live with, our spouse, our friends might not even know that we just saw something that impacted us unless we say something. Insufficient recovery time and volume of exposure is another risk factor. So again, I touched upon short form media and how that can be like hit after hit after hit after hit within a very, very small amount of time and without recovery time in between. So this is something to consider when we're thinking about how do we get our information and how do we consume media. And then the third factor I just wanted to touch upon is previous trauma of our own, right? And I think all of us have some level of previous trauma. Once you hit a certain age, statistically, I think I'm trying to remember what the specific stats, but it's something like 82% of people have experienced some form of trauma by the age of 40. So it's like, and if we continue onwards, we imagine the other 18% get there too, right? This is also just an inherent part of being a human. And I think like figuring out again, compassion is the place where I allow the pain that's in me to be touched by the pain that's in another. And we all carry some of that pain. So it's something to really be aware of and really be looking at how do I get that support? How do I be able to hold that in the context of my relationships and of my supports? I had the wonderful opportunity to talk with Father Paul Abernathy, who's going to be speaking in September, I think, as part of this talk series. And I spoke with him a few weeks ago for our podcast. And a quote from that conversation which really stuck with me was, "Never carry this pain alone." It's very, very important for us to acknowledge that. We have each other, we have family and friends. We also, in the context of our church, have the communion of the saints who are with us at all times. Okay, I am aware of time, so I am going to hand it over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Eleni. What I'm gonna do is talk through some practical practices, some everyday practices that we can think about integrating into our lives and the way that we approach things like news consumption, to like taking into consideration some of what Eleni has shared around what compassion is, how vicarious trauma can affect us, how we're susceptible to it. What can we actually do in a practical way to sort of guard against that while not going to the extreme of just like ostrich burying our head in the sand, and not caring at all about what's going on to our fellow man. So Matt, if you want to drop that PDF with strategies, this is a handout that we developed for this talk, and you're welcome to take that with you. Um, I'm not gonna read it, but I am gonna just talk through some of the strategies um, that we included in there. There's a lot more that we could have included, and that's why we shared those other references earlier in the chat. In particular, one that I had added to that is a book called Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. And this is a book that I routinely recommend to like helping professionals, folks who even deal with like animal cruelty, environmental cruelty. But I think it's very much applicable to those of us who watch the news and have a functioning heart within us, who can't help but be affected and care about what is going on, to other human beings. So you'll find that in the resources that I dropped in the chat earlier. So looking at these practices, these 9 practices that we shared, the first and perhaps foundational one is the importance of just, it sounds basic, but the importance of just recognizing the presence of grief and loss in what we're feeling. I think a whole host of conflicts in the world and within ourselves could be ameliorated if we took the time to name that we are grieving, and then to think about what exactly are the tangible and intangible losses that we're grieving. And because when we don't connect with our grief, it comes out sideways. It comes out sideways in the form of controlling tendencies, trying to dominate or practice false control over uncertainty. It comes out in things like anger, which I've seen a lot of that in the comments of people struggling with things like anger and resentment, which is totally valid, in the context of the sorts of conflicts and situations that we're talking about. And yet that anger, in an interpersonal situation, anger is a really helpful emotion because it prompts us to set a boundary, or it prompts us to engage the person, confront the person. We can't, like, there's like limited capacity for us to do that when it's a global conflict, because like we can't, who are we going to confront? Um, you know, so so in that context, anger can come out sideways and become corrosive. And so naming that first, like, part of what we're experiencing here is grief, sort of gives that anger a context. Like anger, I don't believe in stages of grief, but anger anger is a stage of grief if you want to use a stages model. It's part of grief. And there's an aspect of grief where we can give ourselves permission to let go, or to just let our feelings be, um, in sort of holding them loosely without letting them become quite so corrosive on an inner level. A second strategy that we thought was important was the need to periodically step back and create healthy boundaries, especially if we can do it before we become overwhelmed. It's never too late to set healthy boundaries, but if we can sort of walk it back and practice healthy boundaries ahead of time, it can kind of protect us from getting to this place of super overwhelmed and perhaps becoming even traumatized. Eleni was talking about how different media formats can have an effect on us. And one thing that I think is important is, like, along with maybe aiming for more long form or thoughtful, non-text based, or not non-visual, sorry, non-visual forms of media, um, is is finding forms of media that are story-based, where it's maybe following a family or a human being. In addition, like tracing maybe a macro conflict or issue through the experience of one person or one community, from start to end. That is important because it takes us through the full, it takes us, it doesn't just drop us into the middle of something without conflict and then leave it there. And then the news channel goes on to talk about some random study that was just done on diet pills, and then leave us to clean up the emotions that were just dropped like an atomic bomb on us because they talked about Palestine for 30 seconds, and then moved on to some trivial other thing that has nothing to do with this, which happens all the time on the news. It drives me bonkers. Um, but finding something that's long form, that's story based, that takes us through all of the emotions, through the before, during, and after of a day in the life or whatever it is that it's tracing. Obviously, it's not taking us to the end of yay, things are beautiful and it's one big happy ending again, but it's taking us on a movement, and that can help us too as people trying to take this in. Remember, like, we too can keep moving. Their life does go on somehow, some form of life does go on here. Um, One thing that I do is um, I pretty much only take in news through podcast form now, and the reason is I find it a lot easier to hear from a human voice. Usually podcasts are a little bit more thoughtful, I find, than I don't always agree with them or whatever. I don't agree with their take, but it's usually a little bit more thoughtfully constructed because it takes a lot more work to produce a podcast than to post an article, or like hot take YouTube short or whatever. And there's something I find helpful about hearing a human voice explain things to me. um, I can adjust the pace at which I listen. I can slow the pace. I can go for a walk or do something with my body while I'm listening, and kind of be more connected to the world around me while I'm listening rather than just like sitting hunched over at my desk, scrolling through the news page. I find that to be, at least helps me a little bit take these things in. Turning news into prayer. Eleni mentioned how this is kind of the inverse of thinking of doom scrolling. In prayer, from a worldly perspective, it seems like we're not doing much. And I'm sure we've all heard or maybe been the one to say, thoughts and prayers. Maybe we meant it and actually prayed for the person, maybe we didn't, but it comes off as being kind of a flimsy form of solidarity. And yet, in the Christian tradition, this is actually the very most and the very best of our, short of giving our life for another person, this is actually like the very most and the very best of ourselves that we can offer to people. Because if we're truly praying or truly trying to pray, trying to enter into that space, that is like the deepest form of compassion. We are offering up that person to Christ, and ourselves and our own powerless and our own confusion of where to go, with our own compassion and pain. And I put some ideas for creative ways to do that. The other is approaching other suffering with humility. I think one reason why we can become overwhelmed is we consciously or unconsciously feel feel that we have to fix things. We have to do something. And the reality, as we all know, is the kinds of news stories we're talking about cannot be fixed by any one person. And maybe not even in an earthly sense. These are ruptures that will find their full resolution, not on an earthly plane, probably. And yet we still carry the weight of that. It's natural when we see anyone suffering to want to alleviate suffering. We might even feel, because we're in North America, most of us probably aren't experiencing the level of suffering that a lot of folks are experiencing in other parts of the world. And there can be a kind of survivor's guilt or a kind of like feeling bad about your life because you know you, you don't have it as hard. And so we can sometimes try to punish ourselves or something by I think for me, sometimes that's why I get into doom scrolling is it's like, well, I know this is going to hurt me, but maybe I should hurt a little bit because all of these people are hurting. And if I can just sort of impose some suffering on myself, I can feel better about the situation. Again, that's not helping anyone. It's actually harming. It's actually causing harm, at least to myself, and maybe in some cosmic way to like, humanity as a whole. Um, so, but when I can just look at another person and say, I have no idea what that's like, and I don't need to have compassion. I can be compassionate and recognize the limits of my own experience. I don't need to make this about me. Um, I don't need to over-identify. I don't need to put myself down. I don't need to avoid the suffering of others because I don't have a reference point. I can almost like just revere them as I do many saints because I'm not going to sit up on a pole like the Stylites. Like there's a lot of saint experiences like I have no clue about because I've just never been there before. Um, so to approach others' suffering and our own with humility. I already kind of
I,
talked
I
about,
wanted to just add
oh
one note there,
yeah,
Nicole, because we did have a comment around how do we engage in activism as well, from a place of that compassion. And I think like this is definitely like we're not saying don't do activism. Like we have a rich tradition
yeah,
in the Orthodox Church. Saint Herman, that Father Paul's going to be talking about, wrote letters, did political activism, and did all those things. And that can be part of what that impulse towards action can be. That is compassion. And we also approach it with that humility of, okay, and I'm a human being. I might need to withdraw and have a cup of tea. I might need to like maybe sit this protest out or sit, maybe not write a letter today because of what's going on with me. Maybe I have health issues. Maybe I'm tired. There's other things that like, if you approach yourself with that humility of knowing I'm one human being, um, that also I think speaks to setting those boundaries that are like doable for yourself, right? I just wanted to put that in there.
yeah. And I think one way I see humility coming into that is also the recognition that it's ultimately not us doing the work. Like if
Right.
like anything good, I mean we can cooperate with the Holy Spirit for sure. And I think we ought to. I think we're called to. Um
Yeah.
and I think we're called to love our neighbor and our fellow man. However, when things like pe when peace is brought about, when goodness is brought about, where there has been conflict, like that's an act of God uh through human hands. And so when we can recognize even in forms of activism, when we are on the front lines or we are doing something, it's
Mhm.
God working through us.
Yes.
And that sort of both raises the bar but also takes off the pressure a little bit.
Yeah.
It raises the bar of like, okay, now I've got to work with God on this. He's calling me to cooperate, us to cooperate.
Right.
But also, it's not, I don't need to be the one,
Yes.
the savior here.
Right. Right.
So, some of these other ones I've already talked about indirectly, choosing humanizing news sources, responding to your own suffering without adding more. I'm going to close these strategies with something that Eleni and I just both love, which is the spiritual practice of loosing. This is an idea that we got from the book How to Be a Sinner by professor at St. Vlad's, Peter Butenev. It's towards the end of that book, kind of inspired by the Bible verse, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. He is talking about this in the context of forgiveness, like not news stories, but interpersonal forgiveness. What do you do when you have a situation where like forgiveness almost feels meaningless because there's the atrocity that we're talking about just can't, it's not a forgive and forget situation. Or even my forgiveness like isn't really going to change the situation. What do we do with those situations? He talks about the practice of loosing, which is essentially just understanding forgiveness as a kind of releasing of tension, releasing of our need to control, to grab hold of the narrative, to hold onto whatever is not ours to hold onto, whether that's a particular perspective, whether that's a particular need for something specific to happen. And in somehow choosing to not retain the resentment, or not to, at least to want to not hang on to the resentment, because sometimes we're several steps removed, that too is a form of loosing on earth what may hopefully be loosed in heaven as well. So if that appeals to you, I recommend maybe reading that book, or even checking out our podcast episode where we interviewed him and asked him a bunch about that particular practice.
This is a great
So those
conversation.
are some of the practices that we thought were important. There's many more we could have added. Eleni, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I would love to get to questions, because I know we've talked
Yeah.
longer than we were
Yeah.
anticipating already, for which I
Yeah.
apologize to everyone, but we really want to hear from you. So maybe we can put questions
Open
in
the
the
floor.
pod, or yeah, Anna, how would you like to open the floor?